Wonderful. Good afternoon. My name is Jason Pielemeier. I'm the policy director at the Global Network Initiative, GNI, which is an organization that brings together companies, including several of the ones on this panel, with media freedom and human rights organizations, investors, and academics to promote and respect freedom of expression and privacy in the ICT sector. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank Eileen and the whole team here at GDPi for putting this together, to Stanford for hosting, and to this wonderful panel. We really hope to use this panel to illustrate how companies are operationalizing their commitments to human rights in the development, design, and deployment of AI. And we have 5 incredible panelists who will speak about their experiences working across 4 different companies that represent different pieces and slices of the ICT sector. I'm going to introduce them all up front, and then we'll bring them up sequentially to speak. If we're able to get through things in time, we'll maybe do 1 round of Q&A. We'll see if we end up having time for that. Our first speaker will be Kathy Baxter, who is as an architect of ethical AI practice at Salesforce, develops research-informed best practice to educate Salesforce employees, customers, and the industry on the development of ethical AI. In this role, Kathy collaborates with external experts to continuously evolve Salesforce policies, practices, and products. The second edition of her book, Understanding Your Users, was published in May of 2015, and Kathy will be talking to us about how Salesforce is trying to implement responsible AI in practice. After Kathy, we'll bring up Steve Crown and Chloe Poynton. Steve's the vice president and deputy general counsel at Microsoft, where he helps develop and interpret company-wide policies that support advocacy for rule of law and respect for human rights in the conduct of the company's business all across the globe. And in that role, Steve serves as currently a board member for GNI. Chloe is the principal and co-founder of Article 1, which is a business and human rights advisory firm working to advance corporate respect for human rights, and which recently launched a business roundtable on human rights and AI to support companies developing due diligence systems to responsibly manage the development and deployment of AI. Steve and Chloe are going to talk to us about Microsoft's experience conducting AI-related human rights impact assessment. After them, Jamila Smith-Loud will speak about Google's efforts to operationalize human rights principles, and Jamila works on that operationalization as a user researcher on Google's trust and safety team. Prior to Google, Jamila worked on racial equity initiatives for the Advancement Project in LA, and we'll finally hear from Abele Okobe, who is coming to us from Facebook. Abele has traveled all the way from London to be with us. She works with Facebook's public policy team as the director for Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey. And she'll be presenting on embedding values in Facebook processes. Before coming to Facebook, Abele was a senior legal director and global head of human rights at Yahoo, where she was a founding board member of GNI, and has also worked as a corporate securities and mergers and acquisitions lawyer, a consumer rights advocate, and a senior director at Catalyst, as well as at Nike. So again, a really wonderful panel. Very excited to hear from all of you. Kathy, I'll ask you to come up first.
All right. So at the beginning of this year, KPMG said that there are a number of different jobs that companies will need to have in order to be successful in 2019. And I personally was very happy to see AI ethicist on this list. Good employment future for me. Not surprisingly, we've also seen a real tick up in the number of mentions in the news of AI or artificial intelligence plus ethics. And you can see a graph from CB Insights showing that particularly in 2017, there was a real rise in the number of comments. And I think everyone in this room is probably familiar with a lot of the different headlines and concerns. And this is actually a really good thing because we want there to be a great deal of awareness of the issues, the potential for impact on human rights when it comes to automation and AI. There's also been a real uptick in the creation of what I refer to as ethical tools, frameworks, toolkits, principles, oaths, training courses, tons of stuff. So there's a lot of goodness, not specific just to AI, many of them are, but also just about ethical design of technology and products in general. The challenge here is that there are so many of these. It's hard for any company, any organization that wants to build an ethical or responsible practice to know which ones should they choose. Are there certain ones that are better for my industry? Are there certain ones that are better depending on what it is that we want to achieve? How do you know what to use? So that really leads to the question of, what does success look like? How do we know what we should be looking for? How do we know if we actually are achieving ethical or responsible creation and implementation of technology? And so what came out of that was a conversation between myself and Daniel Cass, Director of Ethical AI at Workday. And we did a survey in February and March using both of our networks, Mail Out to Partnership on AI, and a bunch of other groups. We ended up with 108 respondents from people in what we're just broadly defining as ethical roles. People who may be in academia, industry, consultants, so a really broad range across the US and Europe. Then we followed up with a workshop on the 28th at Workday, and we had 23 of those participants who had participated in the survey, primarily coming from the Bay Area, representing 16 different companies. And so I want to share with you just a snippet of some of the results and insights. It was really hard to wield this all down, to chip it down to fit into about 10 minutes. So one of the very first findings was that the majority of the people in the survey were personally involved in the creation and/or implementation of one of those types of ethical tools that I mentioned at the beginning. A whole lot of creation and implementation going on. That's pretty good. People are doing good stuff, right? So then we started looking at, okay, so here's a list of categories of different things. And so which of these things have you created and which have you implemented? And we found, on average, people in the survey were creating at about 90% one or more of these tools. I find that really interesting because, again, let's think back to that earlier slide when I was showing there are dozens of these different tools that already exist. Not everyone actually has a document 37 pages long of these different ethical tools, and yet, those of us in roles like mine are creating these tools again. But when we take a look at how many people said that they are actually implementing them, that number dropped. On average, it was just over half are actually implementing the tools that they are creating in their organizations. Training, educational courses, things like that was number one, followed by business operations or processes. For example, baking in ethical questions into their software development methodology, other types of decision-making processes. At the very bottom were oaths. Not very surprising. So now we take a look at coming to impact. I don't know how many of you work at organizations that have the equivalent of OKRs. We have at Salesforce, it's called V2 Moms, metrics to be able to evaluate what are your goals for the year, what are the methods, how do you know if you have achieved it. But we found that less than a third of people in these ethical roles are actually quantifying, actually have any kind of metrics or measures to be able to evaluate if they are having any impact in their role. That was quite surprising. What's not surprising is that there's a correlation we see that people who actually have put metrics in place, they're actually quantifying what it is that they're doing, they're much more likely to say that their efforts have resulted in measurable change in the ethical or responsible practices of their organizations, as opposed to those that do not have any measures. We also found that people who do not do any tracking are much more likely to say that they have seen no impact of their work, as opposed to those who do have metrics. So it's really important to be specific, to know, not just for yourself, what does success look like to you, but have an agreement with your management structure about what do we agree looks like success for this role. So now I thought I would share with you the things that in the workshop the individuals identified as being most successful, the things that they have implemented and they have seen a change result. The first thing is access to experts. A couple of examples are things like office hours or different review boards. At Salesforce, we have a data science review board. Before any models are implemented in our Einstein AI platform, those teams are required to come to the data science review board. And in that review board, we're able to talk about not just quality questions and what's appropriate, but we can also have discussions about what's ethical. So a tip there is have an intake form. So before people come in for office hours or a review, have a good understanding of what that team is doing so that you have the right people in the room. If you're trying to do something across a large organization, it can be very difficult to make sure that the people have the expertise that's needed will be in the office hours or in the review for every single session. Second, we have leveraging existing processes. Do not create net new processes, especially when you're early on in the role. Nobody likes to have to go through new processes, new hoops. Instead, take what already exists and bake in some ethical thinking or some responsible practices into those processes. So for example, we already had a machine learning class for product managers at Salesforce. And so we have added in there a discussion throughout that course of what it means to create and implement AI responsibly. Next, educational resources. Those have found to be very effective within many of the organizations. So these can include things like checklists, one-pagers, just references that people can have whenever they're about to do a task that's specific to their role. Documentation of deliberations and why decisions were made. That's important for consistency. People need to learn from each other. You don't want things to feel like they're arbitrary. And so a tip there, create context-specific documentation. Trying to create one-size-fits-all tools are bound to fail. And then finally, create empowerment and agency at every level and within every function. There is no way that you can create a centralized group that is going to be large enough to sit within every team. Sales, product, user experience, engineering, HR. And there's no way that you can be there for every meeting where really critical decisions are made. So you really need to empower everyone to have that ethical mindset so that they know what the values are within the company and how to apply them in their job. All right, so I'll wrap up with 3 recommendations if you are in a role similar to this or you want to stand up a role like this in your organization. The first is define what success looks like and track it. Have a discussion among your manager and the executives so that everyone is in agreement. This is what we are going for. And it's not just your success. It's your managers and your executives' success. If ethics is what matters, if responsible creation and use of technology is what matters in your company, then how is this going to reflect in their OKRs or their V2 moms? Next, leverage existing solutions. Again, don't take a lot of time creating net new, especially if you know that we already have 37 pages worth of ethical tools. Go leverage one of those. And then finally, activate the supporters and sponsors within your organization. The supporters are those that are going to actually be on the ground doing the work. They're going to be supporting and evangelizing the work that you do. Sponsors are those that are higher up. They may not be doing the work, but they're spreading the word, and they're making sure that all of those people with them and under them are actually following the guidelines. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're super excited to be here. I have the fantastic job of getting to skip a slide because so much of this was said this morning. I feel like I'm often banging the drum on why human rights, and Eileen gave a phenomenal overview of why human rights. And if you're not all believers by the end of this, talk to me afterwards and I'll further convince you, hopefully. But I did want to touch on this last point here, right? So we've talked about it being a phenomenal norm structure for us to use, a common language, standardization, but this question around ensuring that AI is released into a rights-embracing world is especially important. And actually, the outgoing Human Rights High Commissioner wrote a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post the other week where he talked specifically about this and said it doesn't matter how much ethical work you embed into technology. If it goes out into a world that is not rights respecting, it's really going to be an uphill battle. And he gave the example of flight, right? So he talked about how flight was this amazing invention that allowed people to travel significant distances and to bring the world closer together. But then in World War II, without flight, we couldn't have dropped the atomic bomb. And so same technology, drastically different outcomes when you think about it, given different contextual situations. He wrote, and I want to quote him here because I think he puts this really well, "When the global order is improving, when there's peace and prosperity, liberal democracies are expanding, repression is withering away, and human rights are being honored, chances are technology will generally be put to good use. If the situation is the opposite, when liberal democracies are failing, repression spreads, human rights are violated, and nations are engulfed by war, technology will become a part of bad intentions." And so I think what I wanted to ground this discussion is that all of us need to be evangelists for this framework, right? And having the business community really stand up and champion the human rights framework only makes it a more robust and appealing platform for others to engage in. So there's my kind of philosophical soapbox to start on. But the meat of this discussion is really around how do you conduct human rights impact assessments on artificial intelligence. And I had the very wonderful privilege of partnering with Microsoft and Steve and his team on conducting what I think is the first ever human rights impact assessment of artificial intelligence. And the first question that we were really stumbled upon or really had to tackle was, what's the scope? How do we frame this? Do we want to look at one specific type of technology? Do we want to think about this much broadly? And in the end, we decided to take a really holistic, broad view, mainly because this was the first attempt at kind of doing this work. And we saw three key reasons why the scale tipped for us towards a more holistic, broad view than a narrow one. The first is that AI is obviously rapidly advancing. And so future applications may impact human rights in new ways than they are today, and we wanted to try and do some futures thinking to get at that. The second is that, of course, the purpose of human rights due diligence is to ideally catch potential impacts before they happen so that we can mitigate them and prevent them from happening. And so we wanted to think into the future to look at that. And then the third key reason, and this is a little bit more unique, but not exclusively unique to Microsoft, is that they have cloud infrastructure. And so they often have third parties operating on their platforms. And so we needed to get a sense of, well, how are those third parties potentially using AI, and what are the products that they're developing and deploying into the world? So with that framing, we started to do a saliency mapping, which was really to try and get all of the potential human rights impacts that we could think of and map them to the International Bill of Rights. And so we did this through a robust literature review, a lot of research of existing products and research materials provided by Microsoft. And then perhaps most importantly was engagement with Microsoft research engineers. And this is where I think the real meat of this project existed, where it was marrying the human rights expertise that we at Article 1 tried to bring to the table with the deep technical expertise that Microsoft Research brought to the table, and figuring out, when you put those two groups of people in a room together, how can we really start to ideate on what potential positive and negative impacts could come of the technology? We then went externally to look at what are civil society and external stakeholders thinking about this space, and did a number of roundtables here with a number of folks who are in the room today, so thank you for contributing, as well as some panels at RightsCon, and then with Microsoft's generous funding at UC Berkeley, a conference there specifically looking at this topic. So we brought all of that together and then applied the guiding principles framework in terms of saliency mapping, scale, scope, and remediability, and came up with a draft list of salient issues and approaches to mitigating any or filling any holes in Microsoft's existing management system. A little peek in terms of what the human rights issues were. This is just a quick snapshot, and I think Judy actually spoke about a lot of these issues earlier in the day, but they range, of course, from some of the things that we think about around right to life to a lot that we discussed today around the right to non-discrimination, and then, of course, this big question around democracy and the right to take part in government. But like all good research projects, we ended with perhaps more questions than answers. And the three big questions that we had leading out of this work was, one, how do we determine who the causal actor is, right? Especially in the case of platform companies, where does responsibility lie for Salesforce or Microsoft, who have a platform and need to respect the right to privacy of their users and customers, who could be doing really wonderful positive things on the platform, but also could be serving as bad actors? And so how do we start to tease out the responsibility and the different mechanisms for managing those risks? The second is, what is appropriate remedy? And this, I think, is really an interesting question, especially given the fact that in a lot of cases, people who have experienced harm don't actually know that they've experienced harm, right? So if you're not seeing a job application or you're not seeing an advertisement for housing, how do you know that you're actually a victim of a harm? And so given that, what are the types of education and awareness that needs to take place to ensure that people know that they could have been harmed and then know how to access remedy? And the third is, how do we address some of the cumulative impacts of artificial intelligence, right? So one company developing one technology may have very wide and significant societal impacts, but the cumulative effect of all of the companies in this room developing and deploying AI can be huge and really shake the fabric of society in positive ways in some cases, and potentially in negative ways. And so thinking about the effect, for example, of automation on job loss, how do we start to think about that as an industry and as a country to try and address that issue? So with that, I will turn it over to Steve, who will talk a little bit further about how Microsoft is actually embedding some of the thinking out of the impact assessment into their work.
Right, thanks, Chloe. And it was a great partnership. It was better than a year. I think we'd planned on about 9 months, and it ended up extending well beyond 12. But part of that was just taking seriously what it is that the UN guiding principles actually expect from a human rights impact assessment. And I suspect many here are familiar with the UNGP, as they're known. But Articles 16 to 23 lay out this idea of human rights due diligence. So first you need to embed yourself in thinking about human rights, and then actually do due diligence. And it actually comes out that there are several tasks that one should take serially and then just iterate and see how they impact one another. But they're identify potential human rights that might be infringed, adverse human rights impacts. Prevent those, think about what your prevention measures are. Think also about mitigation. If you can't prevent it, how can you mitigate it so that you actually have all the way in the original design process this thinking about how might it affect people in a way we wouldn't want? Can we prevent that? And if we can't, can we mitigate it? And then finally, there's this notion of remediation. What would that actually look like? What could you do to provide transparency so people know to look for some remedy to a harm that's been suffered? There's another dimension in the UN guiding principles, and that is the different ways that a company can be linked to a harm. So a company could directly cause a harm, it could contribute to a harm, or it could be linked to a harm, and that's where it's this notion of, as we think about what we're creating, and then we think about how somebody might create a tool. If you think of Microsoft services, where we have Azure, which is storage and compute, and then we have services on there, people can build their own tools, then they might make those available to a third party that might build on that, and it ends up in the hands of somebody somewhere, and a real harm is being caused by that tool. In that case, we're probably in some way linked to. Are we directly linked? What is the actual responsibility? So the UNGPs also have this notion of salience. It's a notion both of severity of the harm, but also, can you actually impact it? So we spent a lot of time working through that. I would say the number one thing that we did much better this time than we've done in previous, we've done a lot of human rights impact assessments over the last decade. The one that really made this one valuable is what Chloe touched upon. We actually engaged with the engineers and the business management to talk through what it is we're worried about as the human rights team, why it is these things are important for us to address as Microsoft, and then how can we actually work collaboratively all the way back to the design process. One thing Microsoft has is a group we've called the Ether Group. It's a complicated acronym, but it's AI and Ethics in Engineering and Research, where we actually have senior executives across the business team, the engineering team, sales team, and our legal and policy team looking at these issues. Brad Smith, if you were here this morning, talked about how we have turned down certain business with our facial recognition. And that's a process that comes through the Ether Committee, and we look through those things and then say, what would be the potential harm? So if you recall, Brad mentioned there was this idea of facial recognition for a national capital. And it's not too hard to imagine, as Brad touched upon, look, this could really affect freedom of expression, freedom of association. Democratic freedoms could seriously be threatened by that sort of thing. So we said, we're not willing to license our technology there. And it all folds back into the kind of thinking that it informed our human rights impact assessments, this idea of how do you prevent and how do you mitigate. So that it's going to be, and it's intended to be under the UN guiding principles, a living document. The notion is that you continually iterate on this as you learn more, as the business changes, as new technologies emerge, and as new harms become identified. But it's one of those things that we think the industry is grappling with in a much more thoughtful way with this turn of the innovation crank than perhaps we did with the creation of social media and some of the other things. So I'm running out of time. I would say the number one thing to keep in mind is press all of us as the technology companies to be taking seriously our responsibilities, and that's to respect human rights in all that we do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jamila Smith-Loud, and I'm actually stepping in today for my colleagues, Alex Walden and Heba Kamal-Grayson, who manage our public policy work around human rights. And I work on the trust and safety team, on one of our ethics teams, and work a lot on providing kind of research-based evidence for how we approach ethical decision-making, fairness work, and so thought that this was a good opportunity to talk about this question of you made me not be able to say it, operation of human rights, and kind of to talk about, I would say, this balance or tension that we're constantly thinking through about providing principled approaches, but with really thinking about what does that mean in practical application with everyday engagements with our product teams. And so that's kind of the space where our public policy and our trust and safety team really do work together. And so in thinking about principles, I think, the challenge of applying principles is really trying to think and grapple with this scale question. At Google, we use AI technology for things that are seemingly routine, like Gmail, spam, recognizers, to functions that search and sort your Google Photos. but also really recognizing that we are opening up our technologies to third parties and that the uses become extremely complicated, and thinking about principles that can fit that broad, range of types of applications, I think has been one of our challenges, but also provides, a real opportunity for us to think about the principles. So I'll kind of go into it. So back in June of 2018, we released Google's AI principles, being that technology should be socially beneficial. We should avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. I'm reading them because I don't have them memorized. Be built and tested for safety. Be accountable to people. Incorporate privacy design principles. Uphold high standards of scientific excellence, and then be made available for users that accord with these principles. And so I think that the goal is that these would be standards that would guide our research, our deals, and our business decision making, and not just words that we can't actually apply. And equally as important as the standards and the principles are kind of these 4 red lines. And one of the red lines is that we will not pursue technologies that contravene widely accepted principles of international law. I think the other 3 are also, around not engaging in applications around surveillance, around weapons, and thinking about what it means and how do we define overall harm, and what is that balancing test between potential benefits and harms, and what does that mean? And so I think these are all questions that we're still grappling with internally, and really kind of leaning on our stakeholders and external partners to help us give meaning to. As part of this, I think that we're committed to doing human rights assessments. We're committed to upholding our already existing commitments around human rights, but really applying them within the framework of an overall AI framework. And so I think that the combination of thinking about already existing international laws and norms, and then thinking about a really product and company-specific model, it gives us a good framework to really move into questions around practical application. Okay. So practice. So the practice question, I think, is probably the hardest question. And I think we're really trying to think about how do we conceptualize, how do we put into actual meaning this question around human rights and ethics in everyday, in everyday. And I think recently we just had our Google.org had a challenge of using AI for social good. And I think in that challenge, it really became clear to me how wide and expansive the domains were. So, we got applications around transportation, around relief-related disaster relief. I mean, I think the range of possible practices was extremely huge. And I think it really brought to me the gravity and the complexity of trying to manage across all of these expansive domains. And so one of the ways that we're thinking about it is really trying to think about sorry, I also have a really bad cold, so I'm managing all of that, so sorry. But one of the ways that we're thinking about it is really trying to think about how do we talk about our principles in actual practice. So one of the ways is fairness, and the team that I work on, thank you, my voice is going in and out. One of the team I work on really focuses a lot on ML fairness, which really thinks about anti-discrimination, thinks about bias, thinks about human rights, and really is a collaboration across many different teams in the organization. So I think on the trust and safety side, we're thinking about questions around how do we engage with social scientists? How do we engage with domain experts? How do we engage with impacted communities to really answer the fairness questions? But also, how do we understand, very specific questions around data gathering, having inclusive data practices, And on the other side, we partner with our RMI team that really is thinking through developing metrics around fairness. They're really thinking through setting goals and really providing those technical tests. And so I think it's the mix of the social and technical approaches for ML fairness that's really been helpful for us, and that we're still really thinking through how to apply in an everyday setting. One of the ways that we do this is that we have office hours in which teams can come to us, which domain experts come in and give assessments and consult around particular fairness-related issues. And it's been really helpful for us, I think, to understand the scope and the types of framing that we need to answer the questions when product teams come in who have very different questions. And it also has provided a way for product teams to get really quick answers to really specific questions. Our team in Trust and Safety does a mix of things in terms of testing, research, and validation. We do a lot of adversarial testing where the goal is really to replicate a user's potential experience, kind of like in the sandbox. How would a journalist kind of break our product? And then working with teams then to think about mitigations and possible solutions. A part of that process also is really about addressing concerns about potential failure modes and really being able to map that to social impact and equity impact assessments to understand who's most impacted when we have failure modes. And then really determine the severity of the failure modes, thinking about what the specific product is and whether or not we can assess risk depending on the type of product. So, when we think about our products that are translation, we think about the failure modes in different ways than we think about products that are related to, for example, using Gmail. So it really is about developing risk models that really allow us to assess for severity of harm. Part of the practical implementation of human rights commitments has really been this merger between our fairness work and already existing human rights commitments and works, and really trying to move out of thinking about it as a checkbox, being able to apply it to our ethics process. And so our ethics process is governed by a new team called our Responsible Innovation Team, which really serves as like a hub and spoke model in which they engage experts in privacy and security across a variety of areas, including human rights and social impact. And so part of that is doing human rights assessments, assessing for cumulative impact and also social impact and equity-based assessments, and trying to bake that process into existing structures and knowledge sources. And so some of the considerations are really about making sure that we understand the complexity of assessing human impacts. And so I think oftentimes part of the challenge is that translation between what are real human and everyday impacts of these products and translating that to really technical teams. And so I think it's a big consideration when we're thinking about ethics and human rights is that translation work between understanding the severity of what it means to be impacted by a product to a technical team who's sometimes just looking for a fix. And so I think that translation work is one of the big considerations and one of the things that we're always working through. And then really challenging the checkbox. Like I said before, I think sometimes a lot of our teams want us to give them the simple and easy, like, give me a form and tell me what to do. And I'm like, I don't think it works like that. So it really is challenging them to understand how complex it is, that it may slow us down. It may take a little bit more time, but I think it makes for a better process when we move out of that, when we move out of templates and really into deep assessments. And then I think the tackling with the tensions is something that we talk about a lot, and thinking about this tension between things like transparency and understanding. I think about the tension a lot and what it means for us to always say that there's like this tension between benefit and harm and whether or not that's actually a tension. And so I think that's something that we discuss a lot, whether or not they're false tensions and we're kind of creating the framework for them to exist, or whether or not we can kind of challenge and take down those tensions and really challenge people to think if it harms some people, then there's no benefit. And so I think part of that process is really getting people to think differently about the technology that they're deploying and whose input really matters. And so, the last consideration is really around the diverse input and really who's at the table, not just in giving kind of user feedback, but really in the decision-making process and really being listened to when we're thinking about these big ethical and fairness-related questions. So that's it for me.
Okay.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
So what I thought I would do is, I know we've spent a lot of time talking big picture and talking about sort of principles. I thought what might be useful is if I take you through some of the overarching things that I and my team thought about, and then to talk about very specific examples. I am now the Public Policy Director for Africa, Middle East, and Turkey, but up till 2 weeks ago, I was the Public Policy Director for Africa. So I'm going to focus in there because that's where the majority of my experience was specifically at Facebook. I'm also going to focus specifically on one piece of AI, and so specifically on, I'm focusing on making the decision about how and when to use AI to address content issues where there might be human rights impact. So just to sort of cabinet for you. And so what I'll do is I'll talk about some high-level things, and then I'll talk about some things that we did, and then I'll talk you through a specific example, because then I think it brings it all together in terms of the complexities of what we were trying to work out. So specifically, I also think it's useful. I'm going to talk very much about all of the countries across Africa. I think typically when we talk about this, we talk about it in a global context, but if you want to see how it really works, I think it's useful to see how it really works in the field, and particularly if you're working across a very diverse, a region as diverse as the continent is. I think I will start by talking about an inconvenient truth. And so an inconvenient truth is that we talk about universal human rights norms, but if you're talking about universal human rights norms across the continent, what many people hear is norms that were developed when many of their countries were either not allowed to be at the table, or where the countries that were developing those norms were simultaneously dramatically violating the rights of these countries. And the reason I say this is important to have that in context, because when I and my team are talking about universal human rights values, even though that may not be something people in this room are thinking about, if I'm in Nigeria, if I'm in Kenya, if I'm in South Africa, people are absolutely thinking about those things. And that doesn't mean that those human rights norms are not universal, but understanding the context in which they were created, understanding that this audience knows that context, forces us to discuss some with a little bit more humility, and also forces us to understand the hypocrisy embedded, and to understand how often we are received when we start talking about universal human rights norms. Why is that important? So again, I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in front of where you'll say human rights norms, and they'll say, oh yeah, the norms that were developed when my country was being colonized, the norms that were developed when your country was assassinating the democratically elected ruler of my country. So again, being able to recognize that this is what the subtext is, for me and for my team it was invaluable. Why does this matter? For a lot of reasons, it matters for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the things that helps in terms of context is it helps us to engage with humility, and it helps us to recognize that we have to earn trust. So what did we do? So first of all, when I started at Facebook in 2014, and it was me. So it was me heading public policy for Africa. And so I had the privilege of building a team, and I had a couple of rules around building a team, knowing because I came from Yahoo and because I knew that human rights was going to be a core part of my role, knowing that I wanted to build a team that was able to have to earn trust. So I had a couple of rules. One, that people on my team had to be from the region. So one of my rules is no tourists and no missionaries. And what does that mean? And that seems like sort of an obvious thing, but for us it actually wasn't. If you see many organizations that work across the continent, many of them will not deliberately identify people who are from the continent. And again, if you think about the issues around colonization, if you think about the issues that will make people trust you less, as a company, and less when you start talking about human rights, that is one of the issues. So I started from the beginning of ensuring that I had people who who were from the region, who understood the language. The other thing that I did did is I over-indexed, or not over, I over-indexed for people who had civil society and NGO experience. And so again, you would think, well, it's a company, you know, wouldn't you want people who were sort of government relations people? I thought, given the issues that we were going to be dealing with, that it was really important for me to have people who were from civil society, who understood on a fundamental level what human rights meant. And so it wasn't, for me, that wasn't a competency I wanted to have to teach from the ground up. Whereas I could teach, you know, I think we could teach sort of tech policy. I mean, not complicated like spectrum policy, but we could teach tech policy. But someone who didn't understand the ways in which our platform intersected with critical human rights, that would be, for me, that seemed like a harder lift, and that seemed like an important thing to index for at the beginning. The second is that when we first engaged, we listened before we spoke, and so that means when we would engage, we would go out into region. The other thing we did is we met with civil society and we went with communities before we met with government. And that seems odd because our job is primarily government relations, but we found that we were able to engender more trust and learn more if we engaged directly with civil society and we talked about human rights. And again, talked about human rights not in this is something Facebook is bringing, but more about we would like to understand what the human rights context of our platform is before making any pronouncements. We also began by solving specific problems. So before we came and said, this is what we want to do, we said, what are the issues that you yourself are facing? And so we'd find that there are things that may not be classically aligned with human rights, but may have had human rights impact. So we may find in particular regions, there were people who couldn't use, there were a lot of fake accounts, a lot of false accounts, and you'd have someone using a false account that was impersonating someone else. They didn't know that they could report because connectivity was really low. They either didn't understand how to report, and so we found that the content that was on the platform across the continent, we had extremely low levels of reporting, and the content, if someone's experience using Facebook in Cameroon was very different from someone's experience using Facebook in the US, because if people didn't know to report, or if people were on handsets that made it difficult for them to report, or if they had, since connectivity was so expensive, were they going to waste their time, say connectivity was like, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% of income, were they going to waste their time reporting, or are they just going to go ahead through their experience? So learning things like that helped us identify, well, these are areas that could have human rights risks, because again, if content is staying on our platform that is incitement to violence, or content is staying on our platform that's hate speech because people aren't reporting it, it has a negative human rights impact, but it's not something we would know unless we listened first. So again, we listened first. We listened first and we solved problems. Finally, when we went to human rights impact assessments, we identified local partners. So again, this sounds super obvious. Of course, you'd identify local partners. And I say this because there are many international civil rights organizations and many international NGOs, and we work with them. One of the challenges we face is that a lot of the international civil rights organizations or a lot of the international NGOs were often not staffed or led by people who are from the region. And so this was an issue for us in a number of ways. Number one, we didn't feel like we were getting content. We weren't getting sort of what was actually happening on the ground, number one. Number two, those structures often mirrored the structures that people in our region were most concerned about. So when they looked at us as Facebook, they saw an American company staffed by people who don't look like us. And then when we partnered with an NGO or with an organization that was the same, they felt that exacerbated some of the issues, and it gave us even less credibility when we came to talk about issues like human rights. So we were very clear about focusing on local organizations and focusing on local organizations that were solving local problems with local people. Finally, we moved to human rights impact assessment. So after doing all of those things, we do and everyone has talked about human rights impact assessment. So I don't know that I necessarily need to go into a huge amount of details, except to say that in our case, we are partnering with someone externally to do them. Those of you who know Michael Samway basically created this function at Yahoo and is now doing it externally. So we are partnering with him and looked specifically at across the region, what are the countries where we saw the highest risk? So we just tiered it. So we recognize that we have a responsibility to do it across all of the countries, but looked at where are the countries where we saw the most risk. So I struggle with creating a static list of countries that are at risk. As anyone who lives in the US knows, countries can move quite quickly into the at-risk bucket while you're not even watching. And so I think a static list doesn't make any sense, but being able to tier countries so that you can identify risk earlier rather than later, so that's what we've done. And again, because we've created those local relationships, because we've engaged with people locally, having their insight. So now moving to a very specific example. So, and we know, for example, in Cameroon, so Cameroon had its presidential elections last year, and we know that in Cameroon there's been a long-standing conflict between the Francophone and the Anglophone side, which is basically created when the UK and the French partitioned Cameroon, and Cameroon is, on the whole, a Francophone country, and so a lot of power was deposited with those who were French-speaking, and then the smaller population of Anglophone speakers were deliberately disenfranchised. And so that happened during colonization, and it has continued. And so it exacerbates, so it's not sort of a savage conflict with no reason. There's actually very clear reasons that that conflict exists. And what we were being told is that our platform was being used to exacerbate them. So a couple things were happening. One, on the Anglophone side, which is the smaller side, and the side that's most disconnected, they were using our platform essentially to organize, which, in the context of the Arab Spring, people are like, organizing is great, but you can see where it goes both ways. So they're using it to organize, and they're also using it to do things like to organize and to tell people where to go. So there's going to be an uprising here, bring arms, et cetera. We also had issues with people using the platform to incite violence and for hate speech. One of the things that was a knee-jerk reaction was, well, if we can figure out a way to use AI to identify terms, maybe we can demote that content immediately or have it automatically deleted. And I'm using this as an example because our conversations with activists on the ground, that was our initial, this is what needs to happen. And our conversation with activists on the ground was unanimous, no, do not do that. They said, in this particular case, we actually want a couple things. One, we want it to be visible, what's happening. So we feel that's our only source of news because we're in a country where news is very much repressed, that it's actually not useful for you to take all of that content down because then we have no idea what's going on in the country. We have no idea what's going on in the region. And I use that as an example because that's something where, as a company, we thought there's an obvious answer there. This is something that we should do. AI is a tool that we can use to fix it. But engaging locally with local activists and with a number of different actors, we came to a different decision. So I'm going to stop there, but I hope that gives you sort of a sense of, this is we're very much at the beginning of this journey, but we have found that having a very local-centered approach that looks at ways that we can be helpful has been something that at least so far has allowed us to learn a lot and to engage in a way that we think has a little bit more impact.
Wonderful. One lightning round of questions. So whoever puts their hands up first, there's one in the back, one here in the middle, and one over there, and we'll take them and run through the panel with them. So the gentleman back there. If you have your microphone, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Sorry.
We'll get one
I'm Joe Mann with Reuters, and my question was for Ms. Smith-Loud, or Ms., I guess, sorry. Do you feel like your team has enough power, given that Google created an advisory board for big AI ethics issues and then disbanded it, and folks didn't feel like they had a lot of input on that at the employee level? I'm just wondering, it's easy for companies to have great policies in place, principles and processes, but not actual power. And I'm wondering if that's a concern for you.
Great, thanks. Did you get a mic? Yes.
I'm not, okay. I'm Ren Elheim, a student in international policy here, also at the State Department. But I was really interested in what Abele was talking about regarding finding ways that you can actually help local voices achieve the things that they're trying to do on the ground. In the context of this discussion about responsibility, I would be curious about your views and everyone's views on where the line of responsibility is for a private company to help societies actually function as societies. So not just the do no harm line, but do you think that there's a responsibility that goes beyond that to help people get along better, to have them have better conversations, not just with their friends, but maybe with people that don't look like them or don't speak their language or that they might be in conflict with?
Great. And then the last question over here.
Hi, I'm Stephen Teal from Accenture. I lead data ethics and responsible innovation. I'm curious from the various platform companies represented if you could comment on kind of the limits of scale when it comes to governance. So specifically around, there's a number of kind of committees that are based in North America that are intended to govern, kind of operations globally. And so are there certain things that just don't scale, and those local cultural norms and understanding those, and we heard that kind of touched on in a number of people's discussions, but really kind of at what point do we have to have those, regionally or by country as well, so that we can really encapsulate what the people in those regions and countries desire and want?
Great. So 3 good questions about empowerment, responsibility beyond do no harm, and the challenges of scale when it comes to governance. Let me just start maybe at the end and work back and see what you guys have to say in response, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so I would say specifically around the question of the AI Council and everything that happened with that, I don't know if I think of it as a question of not having enough power, which could very much be the case, but I think of it as understanding, coming from an NGO into Google. I think I was maybe shocked at the different ecosystems that manage these types of questions, and that they are not all centered in one place. And so I come from a team that was formerly called user advocacy, and I think that's the approach that we kind of take, that there will be decisions made and things that happen, and that internally, there are different folks in the ecosystems who play different roles. And so I don't know if it's a question of power, but I think it's a question of how all of the folks in that ecosystem work together to make sure that our intended function for doing things, particularly with regard to external engagement, actually in practice does what the intent was. And so I think that's what we're managing and trying to figure out internally. And I think we still really do, at least particularly from a fairness point of view, really value kind of the external experience and external engagement as part of understanding, conceptualizing fairness. And so just figuring out how to do it right, I think, requires better coordination among that ecosystem. For the question around kind of responsibility and scale, maybe I'll merge that together. Definitely thinking from a rights-based and even from a fairness-based lens, I think one of our biggest risks and biggest risk to harm for our users is really not having a good grasp on the cultural context. And so I think it's part of our responsibility to work with our public policy teams, to work with our local product teams who are, situated in different places globally, to really manage that responsibility around understanding cultural context.
Yeah. So the question about responsibility and then what local versus global. So I actually do think that there's proactive responsibility. I feel that any company or any entity in society has. And I think if I'm speaking from Facebook, if you have this kind of platform, there certainly is a proactive responsibility. I struggle, though, with how one defines. So I think there was something there about ensuring that people hear different opinions or ensuring that people sort of get along. I struggle with that. So there have been a number of conversations we've had internally about like what operationally Facebook should do about that. And I remember someone saying, gosh, there can be a lot of sort of strife. People are disagreeing on our platform. Should there be something we do to ensure that people, sort of get along? And we had a number of conversations, and this is a community that I myself am embedded in with civil rights communities in the US, who actually said, no, that's not what I want. I absolutely do not want a place where dissent or those hard conversations don't happen, because squashing those hard conversations or making people feel happy about those hard conversations actually advantages the people who are in power, who are disenfranchising me. And so again, I'm not saying there isn't a way to do it. I'm just saying it's a lot more complicated. And quite frankly, I don't know that people want Facebook to be deciding unilaterally the values that sort of the community should have. I think there are things that Facebook as a platform and many other companies as a platform can be doing to amplify people's voices. But I think there's always a double standard, because you're amplifying. There are all kinds of voices that are begging to be amplified, and some of them are voices that you might think are actually counter sort of what your values are as a company, or what my values are as an employee. So I think yes, on the high level, yes, I do think that there's more things that we could be doing proactively. I do think getting the details of it are actually more complicated than they seem at surface. And then there was a question about I think it was, I understood it as local versus global. So with you have these global organizations, how do you ensure that you're getting local voice? And so for me, I'm actually very much focused on local. I mean, it's a huge region, it's like 70 plus countries, but it's still not the US. And so there are a couple of things that we're doing, a couple specific things that we did. So one, bringing product to region. So we had a sort of a human rights conversation about human rights impact in region with product. And so there it was about Africa and it wasn't about the US, and the decisions weren't being made by the US. I think there's many, many other things that companies do that are like that. And I do think there's a value to pulling focus from the US and from the EU quite deliberately.
Yeah, I'll also try to be quick. That question about global and local, Microsoft, we truly view ourselves as a global company. I have colleagues in 55 different countries. If we're not forbidden by law from doing business in a country, we're doing business there, so that means there are about 190 of these countries. The way I always ground my discussions with my colleagues inside Microsoft is going all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I had our human rights team. But Article 1 of the Universal Declaration says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And it actually leads with dignity before rights. My personal view, it's not a Microsoft statement, but my view is to be global, you have to be radically local. You need to understand how they view their dignity. What do they want? And so we both use our own colleagues, our direct employees, and then we have, of course, relationships with people across the globe. But unless you actually understand what is needed locally, you're not actually pushing forth dignity and respecting their rights.
Quickly on the question around going beyond respect, I think the guiding principles are definitely a floor, not a ceiling, and so there's a lot of opportunity. And I think there's really good examples of that if you think about AI applications trying to solve global health challenges. But to Abella's point, experimenting on a platform like Facebook with AI interventions can be really complicated. And so I think a small kind of asterisk to that in terms of really thinking that through and making sure that rights holders remain at the center of all of those conversations. On the local global, definitely, and I think that the human rights framework is flexible to incorporate the local voices. So if you think, for example, around sharing a photo on Facebook, if you're in Finland and you put a picture of your kid running naked through a sprinkler in your backyard, that is completely normal, socially acceptable, appropriate. If you did that in Saudi Arabia, you would have a very different reaction to it and potentially putting individuals in the picture or those who are posting it in harm's way. And so understanding that is essential to appropriately governing at the local level. I'll turn it over.
As far as everything regarding human rights and global versus local, I don't think I can contribute any more beyond what's already been covered. I think the one thing that I would add is that being a platform, one of the things that is challenging is how do we help our customers use our tools responsibly? And so one of the things that we communicate is, before you begin implementing AI to make predictions or decisions, use the tools to examine your training data and see, is there bias that is being entered? Where is that bias coming from? Rather than just spending time trying to clean up your training data and changing your models to address that bias, go back and look at your business processes. Are there specific things that are happening in your hiring, your promotion, or if you're a bank, your lending decisions that are resulting in a certain group being harmed? And what can you do to change those business processes so that bias is no longer entering the training data? 80% of time spent implementing and managing AI is just on the data management piece. Imagine if you were able to change your business processes to address that bias from the front end. You would have to spend a lot less time, so a lot of cost savings, a lot of time savings in dealing with all of your training data and your models. But also, it is better for society as a whole. And if all of our customers can do that, high tide rises all boats, and we can see a significant change and improvement in society.